And thank you for Lieutenant Governor for opening us up. Thanks for your leadership and being willing to lead the charge on this really important work that's long overdue. Um, I really want to start off by thanking Barrick and Kerry. I attended the CATA Fix subcommittee meeting, and which boosted my confidence a lot in their ability to facilitate this work, and also in the subcommittee's ability to listen to each other, try to understand where their strengths are, and also understand that the executive committee and those facilitating stand as a resource to help them get the expertise that they need in front of them to make sure that we're doing this thoughtfully, and not just doing this thoughtfully, but effectively and efficiently. ADA has been law for 33 years. It's long overdue. One thing that's kind of contributed to me stepping away from running for reelection and running for office is how inaccessible the world is, but how imbued at ableism at every turn, in the work that I've done here, whether it's trying to tour facilities in my district or around the state and how I'm not able to do that because of how inaccessible it is, or how when I'm asking and telling, for example, the business community that this is a 33-year-old law, it's not an option, that I can constantly get pushback and I get met with anger. How dare I ask that they enforce a 33-year-old law? So I'm really excited that we're bringing different parts of the community together to try and do this hand in hand, but understanding that we're not going to stop the work, that we are going to secure basic access and equity for community living with disability, and that it is long overdue. So I want to thank everybody for their time and their talents.
Thank you, Representative Ortiz. And this is Barrick Abramson. I'm going to follow my own request and make sure that I let everybody know when I'm speaking. I am joined today by my colleague, Kerry Steele, our policy director. For those of you who we haven't spoken with, I'm not going to go into a long introduction other than to say our role is to be neutral facilitators, to support all of you and make sure you have the resources you need as task force members, and to draw on your expertise to support the work of each subcommittee. So that's where we're going to spend most of today's time. I'm going to real quickly give an overview of today's agenda. Then I'm going to ask Ginny to give us an update on the appointments. And then we're going to spend most of our time listening to you about what we want these subcommittees to focus on, the outcomes, the outputs, and kind of the continuum of conversations. Today's agenda, really, though, Ginny will give a quick update on where we are with the appointments to each of the subcommittees. We'll provide an update on the work that Representative Ortiz mentioned that the CATA Rewrite Subcommittee has begun doing. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time mapping the work of each of the other subcommittees, the Outdoors, Housing, and the Physical and Programmatic Access Subcommittee. And then again, we'll hold time at the end for any public comment if we have any. But we really want to lean on you for two things. Number one, what should these subcommittees be doing with their time? And I know Representative Ortiz is going to push us all to focus on the outcomes and some of the language in that bill. We also want to hear from you if there's specific conversations or if there's sequencing that you want to see in there. Are there particular outputs and outcomes, deliverables? The other part of this is starting today, and in some follow-up with each of you, we're going to ask you how you want to support any one or more of those subcommittees. Do you have particular expertise? Do you have a network of folks? Do you have resources that you want to share? So we want you to help us share structure the work itself and then inform it and support that work. But to get everybody up to speed on where we are, Ginny, if you could update folks on the status of the appointments and that process and how it unfolded.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Ginny Brown, Deputy Executive Director at DORA. And just to give you all a heads up, we did meet the statutory deadline of appointing the remaining subcommittees to the task force by October 30th. And to date, I have given everyone an individual phone call welcoming them to the subcommittees. We also sent out a detailed email with regards to the administration really of this process and introducing Barrick and Kerry, as well as giving them information about who to contact for reimbursement. And then also they viewed the same orientation that the main task force, this executive committee did with regards to open meetings laws and other administrative procedures. So everybody at this point, I think is the next step is just having a meeting with Barrick and Kerry for all the subcommittee meetings members. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. This is Barrick. And we have now reached out to all of the new subcommittee appointees and are working to gather their input. One of the things that we did with the CATA subcommittee, and we're doing again with each of these other subcommittees, is reaching out to folks so we understand where they're coming into the conversation, if they have particular issues that are of priority interest to them or areas that they want to lean on others and need to do some learning, so that we meet on day one and are ready for those teams to get to know one another. So that outreach has begun, and we'll begin as we coordinate all the schedules, get meetings of all of those subcommittees scheduled between now and before everybody takes off for the holidays. As the representative mentioned, we have started convening in the meetings of the CATA Rewrite Subcommittee. And I don't want to spend a lot of time, but we want to make sure we keep you fully informed. And on a go forward basis, as any subcommittee comes to substantive discussions or ideas, we're going to not only brief all of you, but we're going to ask representatives of those subcommittees to join the task force itself to engage in a conversation with you. For right now, with the CATA Rewrite Subcommittee, we spent the initial conversation really with folks getting to know one another and build a baseline level of understanding and trust. We asked people to share things like, what is the biggest misperception or misunderstanding either among or about the constituency you represent? We asked what people wanted this to look like, what it looks like when we get this right. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about when we instead of if we, because that's our commitment, is to get this right. As Representative Ortiz said, we've got an opportunity, and in that opportunity, we see an obligation. So with the Rewrite Subcommittee, it's a little bit different than the others who are all required to submit their report next year, next December of 2024. The Rewrite Subcommittee is legislatively directed to produce its first report this December and a final report next December. What we have done is we've gathered this group who has very different levels of understanding and expertise, is begun to tease out where they need to learn more. We're going to be having a briefing on the law. We're bringing in multiple experts and people to make sure they have a balanced and diverse look at that. But we started identifying which issues folks feel need to get addressed. And within that, we're now working to identify which are the ones that may be, for lack of a better term, some low-hanging fruit. Things like the need for clear definitions. People identified the need for plain and easy to understand language as much as we can when we're addressing the important legal details of it. Then there are going to be some of the meatier issues. Things like emotional distress and damages caps and time to file different types of claims. So the intent right now that we've identified the initial list of about 15 topics, and you'll see that on the subcommittee agenda. We're certainly happy to share that. It's also going to be posted. But those are the things they're identifying. Things like defining a qualifying individual or a qualified individual. Need to look at things like, do we need to look at the caps and modernizing from 30-year-old dollars and adjustments that have been made. So we'll be putting the first report we expect will be whether there are easy things, the low-hanging fruit that they're able to find consensus, and we can include those in the report. The other section of the report this December, and that's already obviously just a couple weeks away from us, is going to be laying out what are the issues that are going to require more in-depth study, some difficult, at times very uncomfortable conversations that we're going to push through to get to recommendations that drive at the results that this legislation calls for us to do, which is addressing the challenges in the law as it exists. So we'll include in that specific recommendations that can be acted on in the short term, as well as the bigger issues that are going to require more work and what is at this time our work plan for addressing those, including in that I would expect some areas where we need to identify additional resources or experts, national experts to come in. There's been some questions about what are other states doing. So we are going to have the benefit of a dedicated researcher working with us, but we didn't want to try to rush too much into a report that is now just weeks away. So that's where we stand with that particular subcommittee. Before I go into the role of the other subcommittees, though, I want to pause and give room for both the Lieutenant Governor and Representative Ortiz, who had the opportunity to listen in on those, as well as are the driving forces and the chair and vice chair here, to layer in any additional thoughts on that subcommittee.
Barrick, no, I thought you covered it really well. I'm always happy to hear people focusing on clear language.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the most important things we can do is to make sure people understand what laws are all about and how to access government resources and things like that. So yeah, kudos to you for that.
Thank you. Representative Ortiz? A thumbs up from Representative Ortiz. So I'm going to move us forward, and in one of those rare moments, I'm going to say we're ahead of schedule. I don't want to get overly enthusiastic and think that means we're wrapping early. We want to make sure we have time for each of these subcommittees. I do want to start, though, with just a discussion of the role of these subcommittees and how we're going to operate as a task force with separately created subcommittees. We have made it clear to the subcommittee, per the legislation that created them, they are not decision-making bodies. They are pulled together to be experts with diverse perspectives, with lived experience, and with knowledge of the issues they're looking at. What they will be spending their time together doing is developing ideas and recommendations to advance to this task force for your consideration. To be very clear, those recommendations may be legislative recommendations. They may not. They may be a mix of statutory changes, regulatory oversight, practice, public awareness, or frankly, the need for cultural changes in how people approach some of the underlying issues. I think in the issue of CADA, it's a little clearer because we're asking to clean up a law. When we get to some of these other things like the outdoor subcommittees, I can't sit here and tell you what the mix will be of all of those, other than we're going to guide them to a conversation that's focused on the outcome. What is the lived experience and the reality for those that we're seeking to improve the conditions and the experience of? And then we'll work with the subcommittee and with all of you to identify what then is the lever of change to get at that. Certainly, it may be statutory and legislative action. It may be other pieces, but it'll be a mix of those things. We will be keeping, as I said, all of you updated as these subcommittees meet and inviting them to join you. Before I continue, Representative Ortiz, I see your hand up, so let me pause.
Yep, I don't mind focusing on policy changes and regulatory changes if it proves to be effective. But I want to make it very clear, based on my lived experience as someone with a disability that has been a legislator, what has and has not worked. And there are some organizations and companies out there that I've tried to work with proactively to make sure that they are working in their own timeline to secure basic access. 90% of the time, I have to either bring a bill forward or threaten to bring a bill forward to get any movement. And so I think that we need to make that very clear to the subcommittees. And I want to make it very clear to my colleagues on the executive committee here of the task force that I am going to be looking for legislation, even if organizations or companies out there commit, like within this timeline, I'm willing to do it. All right, let's codify it in statute then so we can have some accountability and teeth at the end. Because what always tends to happen is that if there is no teeth or mandate or accountability, they will do what they want, when they want, how they want to do it, what's conducive and convenient for them, because that is what has been happening. That has been the status quo. So I just want to make that very clear to my colleagues on the executive committee, and then that we need to express that to each subcommittee as well.
Understood and appreciate that. And I think we will definitely include that in our initial conversation with each subcommittee. And every time, as I said, while we're focused on the outcome, I shared with Ginny that one of the tools that I use with a lot of these work groups is a risk analysis and stress test of any recommendation. And by that, what I do is I say, so you've identified the outcome you want, and you say, this is the lever of change. Let's talk through what the best case and worst case scenario is of that lever of change. If you're going to hold on to somebody's promise, the best case is going to be that they uphold that promise. The worst case would be that they don't. Similar thing, even when we're writing legislative language that leaves room for interpretation. So through every one of these, we're going to ask these subcommittees to really stress test, if this is your recommendation and this is your recommended lever of change, how can that be interpreted? How can that be acted in different folks' leadership, whether that's in a courtroom or in regulatory oversight or in local leadership. And Mr. Ortiz, I think it's going to be a great opportunity to not only lean in on that at the subcommittees, but as we start getting recommendations, I think that's going to be one of the big lifts for this task force, is as you intake these recommendations, to consider that those are the recommendations of the subcommittees formed. It's ultimately this task force's job to decide what recommendations you all put forward, including the substance and the lever and mechanism of change. That's, I think, why it's going to be so critical that we keep you updated. We're here as facilitators, and I like to think we're pretty effective at that. We're going to lean on you for the subject matter expertise to say, that sounds like a good solution, but let me tell you what I've seen out here so we can go back and push on it. Before I go into each of the individual subcommittees, does anybody have questions about the general process we're taking or the role of the subcommittees and of this task force? Okay, I don't see any question unless Mr. Ortiz is going for the mute. No, okay. Um, of course, this is an open conversation, so continue to raise your hands, flag at me, and as we have conversations going forward, I want this to be an open conversation. What we want to talk about now is we're going to go through each of the task forces. First, we're going to talk about the outdoors subcommittee. And we'll talk about what is in the statute and what we're directed to do. And then what I want to do is have a pretty open conversation about, number one, what are your aspirations for that subcommittee? If that subcommittee gets it right, what are the types of things that you're going to receive back from them? What are the topics? What are the level of detail? Then I want to talk about who are the people that you think they need to hear from? What are the conversations they need to have? The Lieutenant Governor and Representative Ortiz have heard me say, my intention is to take people from the comfortable, amicable first conversation into some very uncomfortable conversations. We know these issues would have been addressed previously if everybody agreed. So if I have everybody on a subcommittee telling me they agree, I've got to push them a little bit harder. So as we talk about each subcommittee, we want to hear from you aspirationally about what should be the result of this work. We want to hear from you as task force members, what you would like to receive from them. And then we want to hear as you as the guiding body and the experts, what is it you think they need to discuss and learn within that process? And I'm first just going to real quick read the purpose. The purpose of the outdoors subcommittee is to identify barriers to basic access to and the enjoyment of the Colorado outdoors for persons with disabilities and to make recommendations for addressing those barriers. So I'm going to open the floor with this caveat. I'll see first who wants to raise their hands, but then I will start volunteering people to join this conversation because I want every member of this task force to have input. But when it first comes to aspirationally, what do you want this group to be accomplishing? And what do you want to be receiving from them in the form of their reports and recommendations? What are folks' thoughts on the outdoors subcommittee? Representative Ortiz, jump in.
All right. First off, I want to start by, and we did this kind of in CATA, the subcommittee on CATA, but there needs to be a standard start for every subcommittee. One, that is reviewing the mission of the bill as it is in statute, as it's worded, what the purpose of the task force is. Two, the definition that the bill outlines for basic access. And the reason why that is critical is because it equates basic access with safety. And that is an important cultural shift and legal shift that needs to happen in order to secure basic access. The reason we have stairwells that are designed for the safety of able-bodied human beings, the reason we have fire codes that are designed for the safety of able-bodied human beings that are standard, we don't even think about them, we just do them because that is what is required, is because we have equated basic access for able-bodied people with safety. So it's real critical that we review the definition and really emphasize the aspect that basic access is safety. The next thing that we need to go to is defining what ableism is and how that impacts the way and the reasons why the world is still, or the United States, Colorado is still so inaccessible. We have to have an understanding of what ableism is and understand that there are different forms. There's malicious, there's subtle, there's not intentional, but the result is still the same. And then tie it all back together that the task force's purpose is understanding the mission of the task force, the definition of access, and then the impact of ableism, that they're supposed to bring this to bear, and that's supposed to be the lens that they look through when they're analyzing the problems and coming up with solutions. So that's a template for all of them. When it comes to basic access in the outdoors, it is making sure that our outdoor spaces that every able-bodied person in Colorado gets to enjoy and takes for granted that they get to enjoy become accessible for people with disabilities, adaptive athletes, people that come here for our amazing adaptive sports program. The industry of manufacturers and adaptive sports programs bring in over $25 million to the state of Colorado. And I don't think we tout that enough. I don't think we celebrate it enough. And there are still issues to coming here from when they travel and try and bring their adaptive sports equipment here through the airlines and through the airport. So let's start with that. When it comes through that, when it comes to being able to access the outdoors in their parking, and an example of this is we need to differentiate between those that need the extra space on the side and those that don't. And here's an example. If you don't have a mobility, like a need for a mobility device or adaptive sports equipment, there should be separate parking for adaptive athletes. Because nothing frustrates me more when I'm trying to unload my 20, 30-pound monoski rig and I see a 50-year-old with an accessible placard on their vehicle get out with their skis and go rip it all day without needing any adaptive equipment. Like, if we want parking for those individuals, great. But the purpose of this is to make sure that it is accessible for adaptive athletes to safely drop off their equipment, park, access that equipment, put it together, and be able to get on the ski lifts and ski. That's another example, is that resorts have been asking the 2 lift manufacturers in the world to create larger capacity for people to go up the lift and also increase safety for kids, right? Without any thought to basic access for monoskiers or individuals that use ski bikes or any other adaptive piece of equipment, which is making more and more parts of the mountain inaccessible for us. And so they spent all this money designing for those 2 asks and had no accountability, no need, no mandate, no requirement to secure our basic access. And this has been going on. That's one example. Another would be loading and offloading for water sports like tubing or rafting, or even going to like Sloan or going to Chatfield, for example, making sure that there are accessible parking spots, places for us to safely load and unload to get into the water, into our gear, right? Into the kayak, for example. Another would be hiking trails. There are some that are designed around keeping wildlife in or out. I get that. I know what the problem is. Help me identify the solution then. Don't just say, well, we did that and designed it because we don't want wildlife getting in and out. Cool, got it. I understand that. What are we doing about it? Right? So these are the things that I want to see the outdoor subcommittee really tend to, and whether that's through DORA or the outdoor or OEDIT, all working together individually, like there's opportunities here. It's not just about creating mandates, but it's about touting what I already know, and why I moved here is that Colorado is the mecca of outdoor sports. Northwest is okay. They come close. The East, I don't want to ski on ice. It's all about the Rockies. It's all about Colorado's. We have NSCD, BOEC, Adaptive Adventures, Telluride Adaptive Sports. We have the most and the best. And we have 2, like I know of 2 manufacturers, 3. We have our cross-country ski rigs and mono skis that are made through Enabling Technologies. And we have out of Crested Butte, a paraplegic-owned company that makes mountain bikes. These things go for $9,000 a pop that are manufacturing out of Crested Butte. How can we support those manufacturers in that industry? That should also be a part of it, right? So just really want to make sure that we are starting with the bill that died last year to start this subcommittee, but also very clearly define what we're asking them to do and what exists. Like the B88, I think that's what they're called, the national organization that then passes the regs to DORA. Like, they haven't been, in my opinion, they haven't been taking it seriously, because there are 70 plus members on that committee and only one is an adaptive athlete that lives with a disability. And oh, by the way, he's an engineer and he published requirements in his mind on how to make ski lifts accessible. That work's been done. And now they're finally taking it seriously. So, this is what I expect. We have plenty of resources to draw from. I'm saying this as an adaptive athlete. I'm saying this as a member of board of directors of adaptive sports programs. I'm saying this as someone that decided to move to Colorado because one of the leading factors is our amazing outdoors and the amazing outdoor nonprofit programs that serve people with disabilities. So I'll step off my soapbox now.
No, I appreciate it. And I really appreciated that mix of the technical things that everybody needs to understand up front in terms of the bill, the aspirational and the range of issues, whether it's parking and unloading and the different parties involved. That, as we said at the top, this may be legislative, this may be getting our partners at OEDIT to be as much a champion as anyone else, or DNR or otherwise. I saw Julie's hand up first, so I'm going to go with Julie and then Lieutenant Governor. Your thoughts on the outdoor subcommittee?
Oh, go ahead, Lieutenant Governor. You go first.
Ma'am, you're on mute still.
Julie's a lot more important than I am. But anyway, I just, first of all, I want to thank Rep. Ortiz for his passion and the actual lived experience that he brings. I don't think any of us understand it as thoroughly as Rep. Ortiz. I think one of the beauties of this task force, and I think one of my outcomes that I'd like to see is make sure that we include people with all kinds of disabilities. Because, you know, every disability requires a different form of accommodation. So I think one of the beauties of this task force is that we have representatives from the deaf community and the blind community and you know, every community we could think of, and that we got a person who is willing to serve. You know, I was in Iowa this summer for the Iowa State Fair, and Mark, my chief of staff, and I were there. And one day they completely shut down the state fair for people who have like autism and other neurosensory sorts of disabilities that can't handle all the noise and the lights and the things like that. So it's going to be interesting and also challenging, I think, to make sure that we accommodate everybody and all the accommodations that they need. But that would be my outcome, is to make sure that we are really inclusive on this.
Thank you, ma'am. Julie.
Thank you. This is Julie Riskin, a task force member, and I was actually going to say the cross disability thing that Lieutenant Governor said, but two things, and this to me, it's also, and I totally agree, especially around like looking at ableism and what that is, but this is overarching for all of them, or I'll say it for all of them, is to make sure that we understand that whatever we set is a floor, not a ceiling, that we need to not just look at the lowest, like what is the bare minimum we have to do. In Colorado, we are better than that. We don't do the bare bottom here as a state. And to recognize that by doing that, it's good business. It's not just, you're not like just giving something to someone, it's good business. It's good for everyone. And then also to make sure that people understand that the ADA is also about policy, not just structure. So one of the things that leads to a lot of litigation is not so much that there's a structural thing, but it's an attitude thing. Someone says, and it's often about training, you know, so like the common one, again, I know this is outdoors, but like at a doctor's office, if someone calls, I need an appointment, I need an interpreter, someone at the front desk hasn't been trained, we don't do that. Even though the office might actually have a contract, but so I think as we come up with structures, we need to look at policy, because the ADA requires, and the language is a little different in each title, but basically that there has to be like reasonable modification of policies, practices, and procedures when necessary to let someone, so that policy piece is just going to be very important. And that, and with that again goes training. So people aren't just trained to say like, no, we don't do that. Particularly when and I know the outdoor spaces, some of them are private and some of them are public, but the government ones have a much higher burden than the private ones. So particularly in terms of communication, it's with government, it's communication that the person says is effective. Whereas an employer, like it's more of a mixed, the employer and the person, like the employer can say, no, this is effective, but with government, it's a much higher burden. So, and I know with outdoors, it's mixed. So a lot of them are state parks or state things, and outdoors is where I know the least, but I think this policy thing has to be in all of them.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to invite Kathy and Representative Armagost to jump in. For those who maybe weren't looking at screen, Julia, I just want you to know that as you were talking about the need for training, and as you were previously talking about us setting that there's a floor, not a ceiling, you were getting a lot of nods, a lot of agreement and support across the task force members. Kathy, do you want to join in and offer thoughts on your aspirations, or if there's specific things that you'd like to see this outdoor subcommittee discuss?
Thank you. This Representative Ortiz, that was so enlightening, and I just don't have the background and experience in this that I feel adequate, frankly. And so I'm just really wanting to hear from everyone so that I have a much better understanding. I've worked in outdoor recreation forever, and public lands and all those kind of things, and wilderness and all those particular issues, which have always been such a big part of Colorado and outdoor life. And so I just really don't feel that I am adequate enough, because I don't have that experience. So I'm just really here to listen and absorb and try to make hopefully good decisions on every aspect of information.
I appreciate that. I know the representative does. I'll also say, ma'am, that we're going to lean on you and try to pull you in. I think from your time as a county commissioner in Mesa County, where there are some amazing outdoor trails and resources and rivers, that we want to draw on your expertise and your experience of what we need to do to make this happen in a way that is as accessible for every individual as possible, and to where our local leaders understand they're part of this solution with us.
Well, and we've done a lot in this area. It's been a big focus on our trails, and so that's been a big focus for years. I'm just not, listening to Representative Ortiz, I'm wondering if we're adequate, because I know that we have spent a lot of time and a lot of money to have adequate facilities for disabled, for rafting and those kind of things. But I really need to know if we're really adequate about it, because I know we spent a lot of time and a lot of money talking about it, but unless you have the experience of Representative Ortiz and being disabled, I'm really curious if we are doing enough, frankly. Thank you.
And we're not going to try to solve it now, but Representative, I'd invite you to offer any thoughts. I know he and I have had some conversation about things like trail access, where we both spend a lot of time on the trails, and you don't think about how much space, for example, he flagged to me, is between those posts when you need to get through them. Anything you'd like to say, Representative?
No, I just want to thank Kathy for the statement. I mean, that makes me confident that we're going to get to solutions, is willing to hear each other and work together. Like, I will never know what it's like to manage a county, nor do I want that smoke. So having that input, as people that with lived experience offer the problems and some of the solutions, to be able to then to leverage your experience at the county level, being like, well, this is a timeline that's going to work the best, and that's going to make it the most cost effective and make it the most efficient, like that, where it's going to be where the rubber meets the road, and how valuable your input's going to be, for sure. So I really appreciate that.
Well, one more thing along with that, I've spent a lot of my last 20 plus years on, in fact, I wrote one of the largest wilderness bills that ever passed in Colorado, along with a number of others. And that was always the issue with people said with wilderness is not an ability to get into wilderness areas. So this is all stuff that, we don't have to talk about today, but those are all things that are of interest to me, because of, access to wilderness, for one thing, is one thing that's certainly confined if you have any kind of a disability. So again, those are just things that I've been aware of and worked on all these years, and I don't have solutions.
And yet in this, I think you're helping us to tease out some of the conversations we need to make sure take place, and some of the places where we're going to want to lean on you. As this group talks about, we want to see this. We're going to want to have folks that have the lived experience of trying to access these things that, as you say, Ms. Hall, that there's been a lot of time spent on. They're also going to want to hear from local leaders and from state leaders about what it's like to implement and to oversee these things, and to understand the different perspectives of, once we say it should happen, is that what does in fact happen? Representative Armagost, are you in a place where you can speak? And you and I have not met, so if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, please correct me.
Oh, that's accurate. Thank you.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm excited to be a part of the task force as a disabled veteran myself. I'd love to hear all the ideas that are coming together and making things more accessible for everyone of every disability, and hopefully bring in some voices to the table as a strong part myself, the Northern Colorado VFW and Disabled American Veterans. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be a part of it, and really excited to hear what ideas come out of this committee.
Great. Let me ask, before I move us on to another subcommittee, we've talked kind of aspirationally, and Representative Ortiz has shared some grounding framework, and we so appreciate working with he and with Sarah in his office to put together some basic foundational documents for the first subcommittee, and we're going to keep replicating that. But now we've talked kind of in the abstract, frankly, of what we want them to do. Would love to hear if there are specific conversations that people want to make sure we include. And Rep Ortiz has named some about access to different outdoor sports and the facilities. Are there additional specific issues that you think folks need to have a better understanding of? Are there voices that you think they need to hear from to be having fully informed voices, whether that's talking with manufacturers, whether that's talking with more adaptive athletes? Is it talking with folks from state or local agencies that are responsible for managing these facilities? who do you think is going to best prepare them to have conversations, not just that sound good, but that can be implemented with fidelity?
You know, this is Kathy again, sorry. Kathy Hall, I should announce myself, I'm sorry. You know, one of the major manufacturers is here in Grand Junction. And so I think that would certainly be a conversation, because we do have a major manufacturer of lifts in Colorado, here in Grand Junction.
I think Mr. Ortiz told me that they're one of what, 2 in the country? Is that right?
One of 2 in the world, as far as I was told when I was trying to run this bill last year.
Other thoughts? And again, this is continuing conversation. Lieutenant Governor, did I see you leaning in on this of folks they should talk to, topics they should discuss?
Well, I've been doing some cogitating sitting here. I don't know if the Paralympic Training Center, Olympic Training Center might be, you know, some good experts down there on, you know, adaptive equipment and different things like that. And then, you know, since we are talking about the ski industry, we should probably have somebody from ski country come and talk about maybe some things they've tried and haven't been successful at, or, you know, that. And then also maybe Dan Gibbs, who's the director of the Department of Natural Resources. He might have some thoughts about some expertise for our trails and parks and, you know, things like that.
Thank you. Other thoughts on stakeholders we should engage, topics we should explore? Representative.
Yep, and I'll jump in because I think we do have a member of ski country represented in the subcommittee itself, was my understanding. So just make sure we understand that. I think we need to have Peter Axelson. He's the adaptive athlete that is an engineer that's on the B88 task force, the national task force that's supposed to be working on standards for basic access when it comes to ski lifts and things like that. So he's the name, and his paper is the one that I referenced when I was speaking earlier. So he's definitely an individual that we need to invite individually to make sure that they're involved. I would also like to invite the manufacturers or business owners of the companies that provide adaptive sports equipment here in Colorado, Enabling Technologies, Reaction Adaptations. They're the one out of Crested Butte, and maybe even Aspen Seating, because they do a lot of the seating for the equipment. So that's the 3 off the top of my head, but and it doesn't have to be all 3. We can ask one to represent their community, but I really want to make sure that we're getting their input as well, and maybe members from adaptive sports programs, executive directors that want to come and kind of lend their experience on what they're seeing out there, because these adaptive sports programs don't just do skiing. Like NSCD will do cross-country skiing, downhill, they'll do horseback riding. They will do many different types of outdoor sports, so they will be able to speak to that as well.
Great. I'm going to go to Julie next. And just to confirm, yes, we have Melanie Mills from Colorado Ski Country on that subcommittee. Julie, you had your hand up.
In terms of just someone to bring in to kind of check on the cross disability realm, Adams Camp, I think they work with a lot of people with developmental disabilities, and I also know they host some stuff for the deaf community, and also I think at some point we should ask, and I'll probably say this on each of these 3, the National Federation of the Blind, in terms of blind access. And then maybe someone from Craig Hospital, because they do both spinal cord and brain injuries, and they often, and Rep. Ortiz would know more than me, but I think they also run the Peak Center, which I know is not outdoor access, but it's sports. They kind of help people get set up, so they might be aware of some of the barriers people are encountering. And I don't know if that would be I assume that's their outpatient department, or like their PT, OT people.
Thank you for that. Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah, Julie, I'm glad you mentioned the National Federation for the Blind. When I was at a golf symposium recently, I met a veteran who is blind, and he runs a golfing program for veterans who are blind. So, and has, different competitions and things like that. I've never been to one because I don't want to be beaten by anybody, and because my golf isn't that great. But the golf industry might be another group that we want to talk to.
Thank you. And this remains an open conversation. Today is the initial brainstorming, and to be very clear, the first meeting of these subcommittees is really going to be a level setting and an introduction business meeting, and us really focused on building some trust and working dynamics between the groups. So we'll continue to solicit your input. As I teased at the top, we're also going to reach out with a phone call and maybe a Google survey, although we're happy to do just with conversations, to find out where you want to plug in. If there are areas you want to help lean in particular to help Carrie and me to shape the conversations of each of these. But before I move us to the housing subcommittee, I do want to pause to just make sure if there's any other thoughts for the outdoor. Kathy,
This is
please.
Kathy Hall again. Of course, we also do, and I'm sure they probably do in other areas, but we certainly do have some programs here where we work with people with various disabilities with horseback riding and horses. And that's that's probably a lot smaller than golf and some of those others, but it is it is a program that we do quite a bit of here as well.
And I'm seeing Representative Ortiz nodding. I don't know how we talk Colorado and don't talk Colorado's history with our horses. So we will include some discussion there. With that, I'm going to pivot us to keep us on track to talk about the housing subcommittee. And again, I'm going to read the direct language on the committee title and its purpose. It's the Subcommittee on Affordability, Accessibility, and Attainability of Housing for Persons with Disabilities. The purpose of this housing subcommittee is to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure and affordable, accessible, and attainable housing for persons with disabilities, and to make recommendations for addressing those barriers. Understanding all of these are going to start with the very foundations that Representative Ortiz laid of some common understanding of the definitions of things like basic access and ableism. Would love to start the conversation again. I always like to start it with, what does it look like when we get this right? If we get this right, what is the changes in not just policies, but conditions? So we'd love to hear from folks aspirationally. When this housing subcommittee gets its recommendations right, and you as a task force are able to advance those through every lever we have at our disposal, what do things look like for persons with disabilities in Colorado when it comes to housing and being able to access it? And Julie, I saw your hand go up first. I'm going to get to you first.
Thank you. And I'm bummed I'm going to miss the government discussion, but I do have to leave at 1 o'clock, and I apologize. I just couldn't not do that particular meeting. But with housing, again, I think making sure that every housing provider in the state understands policies and reasonable accommodation in housing. We get a lot of calls about that. It's a particular problem with homeowners associations. We really need that. And quite frankly, we need our civil rights division to be better trained on that and to do a better job of enforcing that, because that's been a problem. And so maybe some beefed up stuff there. And then the other thing, and this might be a little bit more in the weeds, but the Apartment Association mentioned a really cool idea when we were talking last year. And right now we have this very complicated thing in our state law about, there's A and there's B, and you have this many apartments like this and this many like that. And maybe we need to look at it differently and have just some basic, and again, for new apartments, like basic access requirements. But then maybe we say that the landlords are responsible for certain kinds of modifications, because a lot of times, instead of making everything perfectly accessible, which not everyone's going to need, if someone needs a grab bar, maybe we just say, like, the landlords put, again, we have no step entrances, but the landlords put that in, because often that's all someone needs. And then also make sure that we have a little bit of protection for home modifications. No one wants to pay for those for renters, because we have no protection that people are going to stay. So something about, again, not that you're saying someone has to rent to someone forever, but some way to address that is, because if the landlords don't pay for modifications, all of the people that do pay won't pay for a renter. So we really need to address this whole conundrum of renters. And then the other issue with renters is when we have like a small number of apartments built perfect, for total accessibility, which is really doesn't meet anyone's needs, because perfect accessibility, like you can have the standards that may or may not work for a particular person. If we have universal access, so it's not hard to make the modifications, you know, a no-step entrance, things built a certain way so that it's easy to put in grab bars or modify a tub or whatever. Then you don't have to have this thing of like, oh, I have an open apartment and I don't have a person in a wheelchair right this second, and the landlords don't want to leave it open, and that's understandable. But then it's really not okay when there's so few apartments. So if we could just do things a little more universal, then it doesn't matter if that person that minute doesn't have a wheelchair, because it could just be whatever the next open one is. But part of the issue and why we are so adamant about like eviction protections and all of that is because there are so few places that people with mobility disabilities can even go. And then the other thing is the regs kind of, and this happens in hotels too, they cram all disabilities into one. So I can't tell you how many, you know, like they assume that everyone in a wheelchair needs hearing stuff. Like we, you know, there are some, but they need to just make things more universal. And again, that's going to be a going forward thing. You can't redo what we have, but some support from landlords to do small modifications, and there'd have to be some kind of cap, might stop some of the problems. And I was, you know, very pleased to hear that solution come from the landlords or the apartment association. So you know, obviously they have a lot of expertise. So them bringing that up was, I thought, was a great, you know, solution oriented approach. So something like that, but the training and the enforcement of basic civil rights stuff is a huge issue. And again, I think it's often training, but then we need our civil rights enforcement agency to take our issues seriously.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I think in that you've probably given us at least 2 or 3 of the meetings where we need to have some specific topics to dig into. And I apologize, today's schedule didn't work for you. We're happy to follow up with you to talk to you more about that government subcommittee so we can get your input on that as well. Lieutenant Governor, welcome you joining in.
You know, I was just going to suggest that maybe Julie, if she has thoughts on government, give us those before she leaves, and then we can come back to the housing. Is that possible?
I would welcome that if you're good with that. Absolutely. I'm seeing a nod from Mr. Ortiz. So Julie, the floor is yours while you've got time.
Thank you. And I apologize. It's actually a HCPF meeting implementing another one of our bills that we champion, so I can't really not show up. But the government one, again, the policy piece, particularly with government, making sure that they have the modification of policy, practice, and procedure, and the communication, that is really well trained and very well enforced. That would solve the majority of our problems. Obviously, I think everything with government, we have to have remote access. We're a big state. We have to make sure that our communications are accessible, and that includes plain language, which I know our Lieutenant Governor and I have been working on this for decades with certain agencies. And so I think those two, but again, with the government, it's going to be I think it's going to be 90% policy to just say, here are things that we never do. Like if we're going to have a meeting, any government meeting, you have to have if you need an accommodation, an interpreter, whatever. We can't have things where like people say, oh, we're not doing interpreters for things. Like that just can't happen ever. But I think if we have the policies right, the rest will follow, and particularly with government. So thank you. And again, I apologize for having to leave in 2 minutes.
No apologies. Thank you for everything you're doing on so many different bills that need work. Lieutenant Governor.
Well, you know, one of the governor's big priorities is more housing now. And so one of the things I think we need to keep in mind with this group is that we have to have transit-oriented housing, because transportation is such an issue for people with disabilities also. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And then I think one of the things we also need to talk about is aging in place, and making sure that people, you know, can age in place. People with disabilities can age in place just like anybody else. And then using technology to help people with IDD and brain injuries and other kinds of disabilities like that live independently. You know, my daughter asks this woman named Siri or something to turn on the lights and, you know, lower the temperature and do all this kind of stuff. And, you know, that things like that, I think, you know, the general population uses could be really helpful for people with disabilities too. So keeping technology in mind.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Representative Ortiz, and then I'm going to
Yep.
draw in your colleague, Representative Armagosta and Kathy, to talk about housing. But you've got the floor now, sir.
Great. So my basic end goals are going to be stock, acts like and another, and common rooms and being accessible, common areas being accessible. It's going to be huge for me. So like, I kind of like the solution that the apartment association offered. I want more details. I haven't been able to dig into the details. My thing is around stock, and that's why we were talking type A, type B. If we're creating the infrastructure so that tenants can then install their own, making requirements to where then they're not required necessarily to pay to take them down. Like that would be huge for me, because that's just an extra burden. And we tend to be 25% below the poverty line anyways, because of like lack of access, not being able to get the jobs and the pay that we deserve, et cetera. It's all interconnected. So stock, common rooms, and that includes elevators. I had one Craig Hospital alum who wasn't one of my constituents, but said that he only had one elevator in his building. And that was the only building that was accessible out of the 5 of the apartment complex. And the elevator was broken for months. And there was only one spot for him to park in. And yeah, so he just kept going down the list. So we really have to make sure, if we are going to be either renovating or building new housing along these transportation corridors, that we very clearly outline what universal design is and what kind of percentage of the units that we're looking for that universal design. And to make sure the common areas, I don't care if it's a pool, I don't care if it's a mailroom, I don't care if it's a laundry room, that also must be accessible, right? And define what that is, to make sure that those living with a disability can also do their own laundry. You know what I mean? That they can take advantage of the things in an equitable way that everyone else that lives in that building gets to enjoy. And so that's kind of the bottom line. And then maybe also having a discussion whether the end result is, if there's 5 buildings, yes, more than one must be accessible. But like, we at least need to have the discussion on, what does that look like? Are we going to do 25% of the buildings? Are we going to do, if you own multiple buildings as an apartment complex, are we going to do 50? What are we doing here? And to really make sure that we're making contingencies for the failure of an elevator. If they are dead adamant on only installing one, then creating mandates on, it can only be down for X amount of time. You must be able to get it repaired by X amount of days then, right? So, and again, I'm not, when it comes to that, like the devil's in the details, I'm not here to dictate to that subcommittee what they decide, but these are things that should be in their head around total stock, around making sure things are accessible, including parking, including mailboxes, including public spaces. And then something else that'd be interesting to start the discussion on is, how do we incentivize landlords and those owners of these apartments to make sure they're connecting these accessible units with seniors, the aging, and the disabled community? What can we offer, maybe via property tax, since we're about to go to a special session around that? Like, what can we offer in the way of like tax subsidies or exemptions to promote landlords and apartment building owners to do the right thing and make sure that they're connecting those units with those that need them the most? So just some ideas to throw out there.
Thank you. And I'm going to put this to everybody, as I also invite Representative Armagost and Ms. Hall into this. I don't want to presuppose anything, but when we talk about things like elevators and we talk about things like mailbox access, would welcome your guidance to us on how we get this group to think about the different communities we have across the state, from Byers to Buena Vista to downtown Denver and out in Mesa County. Are there nuances to the conversation? Are there aspects you want them to talk about? Or would the guidance from you all be, make sure they are in fact thinking about what the experience is in every different community across this state? And Ms. Lieutenant Governor, I see your hand up first. I'm going to bring you in, then I'm going to go to Representative Armagosta and then Kathy.
You know, Representative Ortiz brought up a really important point about accessibility and safety when we were talking about the outdoors. And when he talked about the elevator being down for days, that just put chills up my spine to think if there was a fire or something like that in a building and the elevator was down, how would this person that, needed the elevator for, accessibility get out of the building? So I think safety has to come into the conversation with housing as well.
Thank you. Representative Armagost, do you have thoughts you'd like to layer in on what you want the group thinking about, or who they should be listening to when it comes to housing?
Yeah, I think just the people that are specifically and directly affected by it is going to be the most important. And it is good to hear both sides. I think of every situation, just to make sure those things that are not being, the needs that are not being met if there's a valid reason, and not like any reason has a sense of validity, but there are times I think where we can listen to those and meet those concerns to where we can see how we as a state can help those entities accommodate anyone, especially as the Lieutenant Governor put it, for those extreme safety concerns and situations.
I appreciate that. And I just want to name, appreciating hearing from all of you, these examples of where maybe it's not yet another law or rule. Maybe there's a way that the state can incentivize and can support and can drive these things through both carrot and stick. And we'll be sure to incorporate those ideas into all of the conversations. Ms. Hall, before we move to the next subcommittee, your thoughts as a county commissioner, as somebody not on the front range with a whole lot of folks here, your thoughts on housing. Are there people that you think they should be talking to, and your aspirations for this group?
Well, I think it's always important to do carrots rather than sticks. As a county commissioner, that was what we practiced really more than anything, was figuring out how we can add the carrots so that we don't use big sticks to put people in difficult positions. But on the comment on aging in place, I serve on a board that we just have built a tremendous program for our elderly here to age in place, called the PACE program. And there's not many of those, but we do have a PACE program here that really does allow people to age in their homes and not have to. But we make sure that we provide care to get them to and from doctors and all the appointments they particularly need. So, we've certainly done that here. It's growing. We just got it off the ground last year because it was very difficult to get the permitting to do it. It's a very intensive program to get permitted. It took us a number of years, but we do have a very exceptional program on that aging in place, which is again part of disability and part of what we try to do. But yeah, I would really like to figure out, as we make some of these programs, that we use the carrot rather than sticks approach. We'll have a lot better results with putting new regulations in place.
Appreciate that perspective. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to our one remaining subcommittee.
One other thing, Barrick, I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Kathy's carrot comment made me think maybe it's because it's lunchtime or something, but I think there's time for carrots and there's time for sticks. And I know Representative Weissman and a couple of other legislators are interested in expanding the allowable uses of the home modification tax credit to include developers and things like that. So maybe just some exploration of how we could expand that. The allowable uses of that might be a good carrot.
I appreciate that. It might reach out to you to talk some more about what kind of conversation we could facilitate around some expanded uses. Again, this topic remains open. Our first conversation between now and the holidays with the subcommittee will really be level setting. So we'll be talking with all of you again to guide when we get into really substantive conversations. But I want to move us on to the government subcommittee. And again, we'll go with the official title and listed purpose. It is the Subcommittee on Physical and Programmatic Basic Access within State and Local Government for Persons with Disabilities. The purpose of the government subcommittee is to study and make recommendations on issues to ensure people with disabilities have access to the services they need, are able to effectively participate in public discussion, and are able to be employed by government agencies and can run for and effectively serve in elected positions. I think this lays out probably the aspirational, but I want to hear it from all of the members here of what should a person with a disability experience 2-3 years from now, when all of this is not just done as a task force, the work has been implemented. Mr. Ortiz.
Thanks, Barrett. So, I've been given this much thought as someone that's been employed by government agencies, that's run for office, that's served an elected office, and someone that's been a lobbyist and also a constituent. So this is something that's really comprehensive and that I've thought in my thinking about. The first step, and I might not even wait for the task force to run this bill, is protecting caucusing, because there is a movement among, and excuse my terminology, I just have no better way of saying this, maggot Republicans to get rid of caucusing. And there's also a move among the progressive branch of the Democratic Party to get rid of caucusing. And that really comes from a place of ableism and not understanding that that is the only accessible way to get on the ballot. The other way is to knock on doors and to get signatures. And there's steps everywhere you go. That's just the reality of it. I could never, by myself anyways, try and gather enough signatures to get on the ballot. So that's something that I'm seeking to secure now, but I still want, even though I'm seeking to secure it now, I want the task force to discuss accessible ways for candidates with disabilities to get on the ballot, and making sure that that's a discussion that happens in the future when we're thinking about changing the ways that candidates can get on the ballot. So, that's going to be step one. And also for people to participate, make caucusing more accessible by making sure they're in accessible places, and also making sure there's a hybrid virtual option for those that's the only way. And not only that, but that will help not just accessibility, but that'll help seniors and the aging participate that maybe can't get around as well as they used to, and also working families. It's a way to make sure that caucuses are equitable in lots of different ways, not just for candidates or precinct chairs with disabilities that want to weigh in or that want to run for office. So that's step one. The next thing, I gotta chime in with what Julie said. Like, we should be doing virtual participation in everything that we do when it comes to all things government, especially if they're public, and even including input from the public. And we've had these, and this is why I start with the bill that was last year. We've had conversations with our rural counterparts, like, if you don't have that great of broadband, then do it telephonically. There has to be a way for people to hear it, and then, or requesting services, if they're hard of hearing, there's a way to request services, even if you do it via a phone call. And then also make sure that they can get input that way. So making sure that everyone that's a constituent has access to it. Then it's about serving in office as well. There has been some groundbreaking changes made to that building. The Senate went ahead and renovated it and did not make the entire Senate floor accessible. And I even got told, well, we made it more accessible. And I was like, is there a single step at all? Yes. And I was like, then it's still not accessible. Great. You got rid of a lot of steps. But if there is one single step, guess what? That's not accessible, at least not for someone like me. So, I mean, and not only that, but even on the House floor, I'm relegated to one corner of that entire chamber, when your job is literally about being able to get to your colleagues and building relationships, right? And not even to mention those that are visually impaired, those that are audibly impaired. So there is a lot of work that we need to do in discussing how do we make places that elected serve accessible for all the cross-disabled coalition, those that live with various disabilities. The next thing is about staff that work for the state, staff that work for like aides, staff that work for the nonpartisan in the building, for counties, doesn't matter. The one thing that kind of opened my eyes was the visually impaired community came to me, especially if they were managers, when it came to like doing PTO and using the programs that the state contracts for, they are not accessible. So how are we changing the way we contract and making that a requirement, right? That if you're going to offer a program, that program must be accessible so that our staff that live with the disability can also be managing their teams like they should be managing, right? So that's another topic of discussion. So whether we're talking about constituents, whether we're talking about those that are employed to lobby, whether we're talking about those that are employed by the state, whether we're talking about candidates, whether we're talking about elected leaders, we are talking about basic access throughout the entire life cycle in all of the buildings, in all of the places, and all of the programs, and all of the apps that are used, bottom line, like that. And what does that timeline look like? Because when I attempted to bring this bill forward just around basic access to the state capitol, I was slapped with a $40 million fiscal note. And so my comment was like, oh, so you're telling me you've been discriminating against us to the tune of $40 million. That's what you're telling me, right? So then let's talk about a timeline that makes it feasible and that makes it cost effective. I understand that we have budgetary constraints, but budgetary constraints aren't used for anything else to discriminate against any other group of people. You just do it. So we need to make sure that we're having those conversations. There was one more thing, but I'm sure it'll come to me later. I'll let someone else talk.
Thank you, Representative. And I appreciate you naming that full spectrum, from getting on a ballot to serving in office to citizen participation. I think there's a lot for this group to tackle, but a lot that needs to be addressed. So really appreciate that. Who else has thoughts on either the topics or the aspirations? And I think Mr. Ortiz is, between all of the lines, has named what the aspiration is. It's fix it. It's make it all accessible. But really want to hear from other folks. Who do you think this group would benefit from hearing from? Whether that's the architects or the person that has tried to get on a ballot and had to go knock on doors down dirt roads. Who else should they be listening to?
I think it's imperative that we get the Secretary of State's office to weigh in, because, and the chairs of the parties that exist. I mean, I think it is important to get those inputs, even if they might not be supportive of the end game or goal. And I don't want to make assumptions on people, but like, we do need their input and their participation.
We will reach out. Lieutenant Governor.
You know, I hired a person who's quadriplegic in my office, and I can't tell you the hoops we had to jump through to try and figure out accommodations and who was going to pay for them and things like that. So, you know, I think it's a real barrier to hiring people with disabilities in government, because staff don't really understand how you can make that happen. And so I think, you know, a lot of education needs to happen amongst hiring authorities in government, state government, to make sure that they know that there's money for accommodations if there is, and where you go and how you make it happen, and, you know, all those things. So I think, you know, that's really important. I think there's one automatic door opener, Representative Ortiz, in the Capitol, and that happens to be in my office. So, you know, I agree with you. It's really hard for someone. I remember I used to watch Tara Smith try and get into my office, and she would struggle to try and get the door open, and then the wheelchair would be her doorstop, and then she would, you know, finally get in. And I said, you know, people with disabilities shouldn't have to do this. So there's a lot of room for work with accommodations in state government.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. As I'm about to start calling on people, and I know we get 75 minutes into a meeting and people get a little tired, I'm going to ask everybody to stick with us for this last 15 and help us get this right. But I want to bring back to the title of this subcommittee. It is the Subcommittee on Physical and Programmatic Basic Access within State and Local Government for Persons with Disabilities. So I would love for folks to, again, think about the conversations that need to take place to hit on all of the levers to ensure we're talking about all people at all local levels of government. And I'm going to first leave it open, and then I will just telegraph. I'm going to call on Representative Armagost and Commissioner Hall, and then I will invite the Lieutenant Governor and Representative Ortiz back in. But I'd love your thoughts on what are the conversations. We've had some talk about what things look like at the state capitol or accessing that ballot. Given that our goal and our mission that we will succeed at is to improve access to state and local government, what are some of the conversations we need to be having? Who do we need to be engaging to make sure we're getting all perspectives at the table?
Sorry, was that directed to me?
I will bring you in since you're on camera, sir. Yes.
All right. Yeah, I think wherever we can apply the argument to, I think in government, we're all familiar with the theory of it's the way it's always been done, or just kind of the historical nature or structure of things, and not wanting to diminish historic value of this and that. We need to bring people in that are willing to make it to where we can make things accessible, I think, without diminishing. I think there's plenty of ways of doing it without diminishing any kind of historic value or disrupting the theory of just because it's always been done a certain way doesn't mean that it's not ready for some change or revamping.
Appreciate that. Ms. Hall, your thoughts. And I don't want you to think I'm picking on you, but as a county commissioner, while I keep saying, hey, this isn't just state, this is making sure there's access to the buildings, the ballots, and the town halls at the local level, what conversations do we need to make sure we're including, and whose perspectives do we need to make sure are at this table as presenters or as experts?
Well, I was just, sitting there trying to contemplate. When I was a county commissioner, we built 8 buildings because we had so many that were not accessible and really old and falling apart. But I'm thinking about, there's so many really small counties out there, that probably have not been able or had the resources to address getting into their courthouses and those kind of things. So I was just sitting there kind of contemplating, because I know what we did here, but we had the resources that we could, we were a big enough county, we had the resources. I think maybe because I'm just thinking back through the courthouse when we rebuilt it so that every floor was accessible to anybody. And so they could come and testify and all those kind of things. Because what we had originally, when I started, you couldn't get in if you had a disability. But we redid all those buildings, and we made sure we had ability, if you were hard of hearing, you could hear. But I'm just thinking that probably one of the areas that might be difficult are some of these really small counties that those facilities were built years ago, kind of like our capital was built years and years ago, and may not have the resources. So that's just what I was kind of thinking through there, is where there might be some of those difficulties. But I was going to say, I know we worked really hard here to make sure that everybody that it was accessible for everyone. But boy, some of those small counties, I'm just thinking about, I've always worked in so many of the other counties here, and I know a lot of those courthouses are old and not accessible. They've changed a lot of them, but I'm thinking back, and there's some really small counties that may be a case. I don't know. I guess we'd have to bring in and figure out how we could do that. But
No, I appreciate that. And I will tell all of you, our approach to each of these conversations is not to allow it to be, we would, but that could happen, but every conversation is going to focus on what the outcome is that should be, what the state of things should be. We'll then have a second tranche of conversations that are how do we get there? What are the barriers? How do we overcome them? It's not a question of should we or do we. It will be, this is the end state the subcommittee envisions. This is what might be in our way, and this is how we are going to overcome it. So at each of those, we're going to be drawing on each of your perspectives to understand whether it is a state, a local, a mixed, or a private sector, depending on which of these subcommittees. I think this has been, I can tell you this has certainly been very helpful for us. We're just about at the time on the agenda. I do want to, before I move us on, just check in whether on this last conversation around the government access or on any of the subcommittees, if there's final, and by final, I only mean for today, certainly not for the duration of our work, but next thoughts you'd like included, Lieutenant Governor.
Thanks, Barrick. Well, when Rep Ortiz was talking about the lack of accessibility on the House floor, I remember many times I said that running for office was for the rich, the able-bodied, and or people that had a spouse that worked and they could just, the other spouse could quit and run for office, because it really leaves out a lot of people running for office. So, maybe we should have somebody from the County Clerks Association come, Colorado Municipal League, Colorado Counties Inc., special districts be invited. And then, Josh, I think, said there's a person named Kevin who is the ADA coordinator for the state. And I bet not hardly anybody knows that. And there's also a $400,000 pot of money that we can use for accommodations. And I bet hardly anybody even knows about that either when they're doing their hiring and have an applicant that might need accommodations. So those would be the kinds of people that I think we should bring in. And then maybe OIT, we have Teresa, who works on accessibility of technology in the state. So maybe she could come in and talk a little bit about the work that they're doing to make websites and those kinds of things accessible.
Wonderful. Thank you. We will pick up on all of those. Rep Ortiz.
Yeah, I definitely second that last statement by Lieutenant Governor. OIT was amazing when we were running basic access for internet and web access. And the governor's team has been amazing too in making sure OIT has the resources that it needs to really accomplish this well. So I think they would be a great resource to bring in and talk about how they're doing it effectively and efficiently. The last things I want to bring up too is an issue that recently came up with American Sign Language, ASL interpretation. We are having 2 disability rights conferences at the state capitol, one pre-session, one during session, and got refused to cover ASL interpretation because technically by the law, they're not required to. They're only required to cover committee and floor work, which, oh, I've got a bill for that, believe me. And so part of it has, and I don't know if y'all know this about me, but I can be a little bit rough around the edges and a little bit vindictive. So part of it was like, all right, you want to do that? I'm going to make it as painful as possible and request ASL interpretation every day of session for the last year that I'm there. Not doing that anymore because I've had conversations, but I did request it for special session, and the rigmarole and the hoops that even asking them to do what they're required to do by law, that has to change. I should request it. They should do it. It should be as easy as that. And that's not been the experience. So I just want to bring that up too. I want to go back to the historic value because when I was a lobbyist, that like intern and lead lobbyist for veterans at the state cap from 15 until about 18, that was used a lot as an excuse. And it wasn't until I got elected they finally started renovating the building. Oh, the historic value. And the bottom line is your right to exist as a historic building ends when you choose to utilize that building for the people's work. Dot, period, full stop. That's it. And so we got, I mean, even Mount Vernon, which is a museum and a historical site, has installed accessibility options that make the entire first floor accessible. So if a museum, if a historical home from early on in this nation's history can at least make the entire first floor accessible, then your right to exist as an historic building ends when you decide to utilize it for the work of the people. And so we really got to wrap our heads around that. And there's a way, like the lift that they installed into the speaker's dais in the House, they did it in such a beautiful way that still respects the historical aesthetic of the building. Like there's a way to mirror and match history with access. When it comes to the smaller counties, I do hear that. And what I would like to see happen, or the outcome would be, then create a long-term plan. I'm not asking you to do it next year. 5 years from now, if you don't have the resources, let's talk about a 10-year plan. But it's going to happen eventually. But in the meantime, like, what are we doing as the workaround? Then you, more than others, since you can't physically allow people into your courthouse, you should be pushing for that accessible option, or for the virtual option, excuse me, as a workaround or a means to be accessible then, right? Like what are the other ways that you can then still make these services, or having to come and participate in the courthouse, accessible while you are working on this longer term plan to become accessible? So really for me, it's about timeline and making sure that it's long enough to where it's not overly burdensome, but what are the immediate, example, virtual option that you're going to do to make sure you're making things accessible?
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to bring in the Lieutenant Governor. I do just want to name for anybody who is watching this stream, either live or watching it archived, normally this would be the time for public comment. We have nobody on screen or has submitted the chat an intention or an interest in public comment. That is the only reason we are not holding that during this. But during all meetings, we reserve time at the end for public comment. So hearing none, we will conclude that section of the agenda. And Lieutenant Governor Primavera, I'll turn it back to you.
You know, when Kathy and Rep. Ortiz were talking about historic buildings, it all of a sudden was an aha moment for me about how the disability community has been dissed historically for generations. Nobody can tell me that in the 1800s or 1700s, when these buildings were built, that there weren't people that used wheelchairs. You know, you see those old funny looking wheelchairs that have no technology or anything like that. There were people back then that had to use wheelchairs to get around, and to totally ignore that part of the population in the construction of these old buildings was kind of an eye opener when Kathy and Rep. Ortiz were talking today, because it's a community that's been dissed for a really long time, and it's time that it stops.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I was going to turn it to you for final remarks, but I think you've finished this with some guidance for all of us. I will just finish with clarifying what next steps and our next actions will be. For those of you who had been watching the CCRD website where materials for this task force are posted, there was a bit of a migration. I think it was from Drupal this to Drupal 26, whichever it was. That's now complete. So all notices of these meetings and the subcommittees are posted on the CCRD calendar. Materials will be posted there. All meetings will be streamed. Carrie and I are working right now with members of the recently appointed subcommittees to get all of those scheduled. They will all meet before the holidays begin. We'll follow your directions on where we're going with all of these. I will circulate to the chair and vice chair the agendas that we will be using, which will again follow largely the framework that we developed with Mr. Ortiz for the first CADA rewrite, and take all of your input here. We will also be following up with all of you to get further input, both on topics and ambitions, but also where you, and I'm going to say want to, it may be willing to, because I'm going to drag you all in, where you want to lean in on some of these subcommittees. We've got the December task force meeting scheduled. You should have received that, I believe. And then we're going to be working with the chair and vice chair to see if we can't get dates on the calendar for at least the first quarter of 2024, recognizing that not only do we have a special session kicking off, but we've got session coming up. So I know that always presents unknowns on timing. We're going to continue to shoot for this lunch hour in hopes that we can squeeze in between morning sessions and committees. But Ms. Primavera, Lieutenant Governor, I'll hand it over to you for final comments.
Sorry, I don't know why. I think I must have had too much coffee today or something, but I would just first of all really like to thank from the bottom of my heart Rep. Ortiz for bringing this committee forward. It's been a long time coming, and I want to thank him and Rep. Armagost for their service. I'm sorry that they became injured or disabled with their service, but at least they're using that to make lemonade out of lemons. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your service and your passion for this effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, with exactly 1 minute to spare, thank you all for the honor of supporting this work. We will be in touch by email, and we will see you again next month.